Pack your things and get out. You're fired, boomed a voice as everyone in the boardroom froze. The janitor, still wearing his navy blue uniform, stood at the head of the long table. The CEO, Robert Timmons, stared back in disbelief, his face pale. Who do you think you are? Timmons barked, trying to save face. I'm the owner of this company, the janitor said calmly, removing his cap to reveal a sharp, authoritative look. And I've had enough of your incompetence and arrogance. Consider this your last day. The room erupted in murmurs. The senior managers looked at each other, stunned. Some whispered under their breath, while others gawked at the janitor as if seeing him for the first time. The security team hesitated at the door, unsure if they should act. I don't believe this nonsense, Timmons spat. Prove it. With a slight smirk, the janitor pulled out a folder from his cleaning cart. He flipped it open, revealing legal documents with the company's name at the top and his signature at the bottom. A few gasps escaped the crowd. Oh, it's real, he said. I've owned this company for the past 5 years. Timmons was speechless. His lips trembled, but no words came out. The janitor's piercing eyes locked onto his. You mocked me, humiliated me in front of others, and ran this company into the ground with your reckless decisions. Now it's time for consequences. The boardroom went silent. Everyone held their breath as the janitor leaned in closer to the CEO. And this is just the beginning. It all started 6 months ago when John Harris, a middle-aged black man, applied for the janitor's position at Orion Corporation. He had no intention of revealing who he truly was, at least, not yet. Orion had been his father's dream company before its collapse. After John secretly acquired the company, he decided to observe how things were being run without anyone knowing his true identity. His first day on the job was uneventful but telling. While mopping the lobby floor, he overheard 2 managers discussing layoffs over coffee. They laughed about cutting entry-level jobs while increasing their own bonuses. Guess it's their turn to feel the pinch, one said, grinning. John clenched the mop tightly, forcing himself to stay calm. He'd seen greed before, but not like this. It wasn't long before he realized the company's problems ran deep. Days turned into weeks, and John saw it all. Employees skipped lunch breaks to meet deadlines, while upper management held lavish retreats on the company's dime. Office gossip painted Timmons as a tyrant, but no one dared to speak against him. Meanwhile, the janitorial staff was treated like invisible workers, ignored unless something went wrong. Hey, janitor, Timmons sneered one afternoon, snapping his fingers as if calling a dog. You missed a spot over there. John nodded silently and wiped the floor again, even though it was spotless. Timmons chuckled, turning to his colleagues. See? That's how you keep people in line. Show them who's boss. It was moments like these that tested John's patience, but he knew the time wasn't right to act. He needed more information, more proof of the rot within the company. One day, while cleaning an executive office late at night, John found a file carelessly left open on the desk. It contained financial statements that didn't add up. Suspicious, he started taking notes. Over the next few weeks, he uncovered a pattern of embezzlement. Money siphoned into offshore accounts under the guise of operational expenses. The pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. Timmons and his inner circle were bleeding the company dry, while the rest of the staff struggled to keep the business afloat. John knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. But John wasn't just sitting on the sidelines. One morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was eerily quiet, with only the sound of his footsteps echoing in the halls. He slipped into the conference room and placed a hidden recorder under the table. Hours later, during a heated meeting, the recorder captured damning evidence. Timmons boasting about his schemes. As long as the shareholders stay clueless, we're untouchable, he said with a laugh. Who's going to stop us? The janitors? John's blood boiled when he listened to the tape that evening. He knew it was time to expose the corruption, but he also knew the reveal had to be perfectly timed. The climax of John's undercover mission came on a Friday afternoon during an all-staff meeting. The tension in the air was palpable as Timmons prepared to give his quarterly address. Employees shuffled nervously in their seats, knowing layoffs were imminent. John, still in his janitor uniform, wheeled his cleaning cart into the back of the room. Nobody paid him any attention. until he walked straight up to the podium and grabbed the microphone. "What the?" Timmons began, but John cut him off. "Sit down, Robert. This isn't your stage anymore." The room erupted into chaos as employees turned to look at the janitor who dared to confront the CEO. "I've been watching this company rot from the inside," John said, his voice steady but firm. "And I've had enough." He reached into his cart and pulled out a folder, the same one he would later present in the boardroom. "This contains proof of your crimes. Fraud, embezzlement, the works. I've already sent copies to the board and law enforcement." Timmons' face turned beet red. "You're bluffing," he hissed. But the crowd wasn't so sure. The janitor who never spoke was now commanding the room like he owned it, which, as they would soon find out, he did. As the meeting spiraled into a frenzy, John knew he had everyone's attention. But just as he was about to reveal the full extent of Timmons' betrayal, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the hallway. The door burst open, and 2 police officers stepped inside. "Robert Timmons," one said, holding up a warrant. "You're under arrest." The employees gasped. Timmons tried to protest, but the officers weren't having it. "You have the right to remain silent," the other officer said, cuffing him. John stood back, letting the scene unfold. He knew this was only the beginning of the storm that was about to hit Orion Corporation. But as he looked around the room, he couldn't help but notice the mix of fear and hope in the employees' eyes. For the first time in years, they saw a glimmer of change on the horizon. The room was eerily silent as Robert Timmons was escorted out by the officers, his furious protests echoing down the hallway. All eyes turned to John, the janitor who had just turned their world upside down. "Who are you?" someone in the crowd asked, their voice trembling. John took a deep breath. "My name is John Harris," he said, meeting their gazes one by one. "And I own Orion Corporation." The murmurs grew louder, disbelief spreading like wildfire. Some looked skeptical, while others leaned in, eager to hear more. John raised his hand, silencing the room. "Let me explain everything," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. The story of how John came to own Orion Corporation started long before anyone in that room had joined the company. His father, Charles Harris, was one of the original founders of Orion. Charles had poured his heart and soul into the business, building it from the ground up alongside his 2 closest friends. Together, they dreamed of creating a company that would change lives. But dreams often clash with reality. After years of success, disagreements over the company's direction led to a bitter falling out between the founders. Charles was outvoted on a major decision, and his shares were sold off without his consent. Devastated, he walked away from Orion, leaving behind everything he had built. John, just a teenager at the time, watched his father's heartbreak unfold. He vowed that one day he would make things right. But life wasn't kind to the Harris family after that. Charles struggled to find steady work, and the family fell into financial hardship. John worked odd jobs to help make ends meet, eventually earning a scholarship to college. While studying business, John kept a close eye on Orion Corporation. The company had grown immensely, but it was clear to him that the original vision had been lost. Greed and corruption had taken root, eroding the foundation his father had laid. Years later, after building his own successful career, John made a bold decision. He began secretly buying back shares of Orion, one by one, using intermediaries to avoid drawing attention. It took years of careful planning, but eventually, he gained controlling interest in the company. Still, John wasn't satisfied. Owning the company wasn't enough. He needed to understand the rot from within. That's when he devised his plan to go undercover as a janitor. As John recounted his story to the employees in the room, their expressions shifted from skepticism to awe. "I needed to see the truth for myself," he said, "and I saw it all. How you've been treated, how resources have been wasted, and how this company has lost its way." "But why didn't you do anything sooner?" someone asked, their tone tinged with frustration. "I wanted to make sure I had everything I needed to expose the corruption," John replied. "If I acted too soon, Timmons and his cronies could have covered their tracks. I needed undeniable proof, and now we have it." The days following Timmons' arrest were chaotic. The news spread quickly, with headlines like "CEO arrested amid corporate scandal," and Janitor turned owner shocks industry, dominating the media. Reporters camped outside Orion's headquarters, hoping to catch a glimpse of John or anyone willing to share inside information. Inside the company, the atmosphere was tense. Employees whispered in break rooms, unsure of what the future held. Some worried about losing their jobs, while others felt a spark of hope for the first time in years. John wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting with the remaining senior management team, most of whom had been complicit in Timmins' schemes. They sat around the boardroom table, fidgeting nervously as John entered the room, not in his janitor uniform, but in a sharp suit that commanded respect. "Let's get one thing straight," he began, his tone firm. "Orion Corporation is no longer a playground for greed and corruption. If you're here to serve yourselves, you're free to leave. But if you're willing to work for the good of this company and its people, then stay, and be prepared to earn back their trust." A few managers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. One of them, a woman named Karen Wilson, raised her hand. "Mr. Harris, if I may, some of us didn't know the full extent of what Timmins was doing." John's eyes narrowed. "Ignorance is not an excuse," he said. "You were in positions of power. It was your responsibility to ask questions, to dig deeper. But I'm willing to give you a chance to prove yourselves. The question is, are you willing to take it?" One by one, the managers nodded, though their faces betrayed varying levels of sincerity. John made a mental note to keep a close eye on them. While cleaning house at the top, John also made it a priority to connect with the rest of the staff. He held open forums where employees could voice their concerns and share ideas for improvement. At first, attendance was sparse. Many were still wary of him. But as word spread about his sincerity, more people began to show up. John listened carefully, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. He made it clear that he valued their input and was committed to creating a culture of transparency and respect. One day, during a particularly candid forum, a young marketing associate named Rachel stood up. "Mr. Harris, I just want to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "For years, we felt invisible. No one cared about us, not the managers, not Timmins. But you see us. And that means everything." John felt a lump in his throat as the room erupted into applause. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope in their eyes, a hope he knew he couldn't let fade. Just as things seemed to be turning around, disaster struck. Late one night, John received a panicked phone call from one of his legal advisors. "John, we've got a problem," the advisor said, his voice urgent. "Timmins' legal team is filing an injunction against you. They're claiming you acquired the company through fraudulent means." John's heart sank. "What are you talking about?" "Everything was by the book. They're saying you used insider information to buy the shares," the advisor explained. "If the court sides with them, you could lose everything." John gripped the phone tightly, his mind racing. He knew this was Timmins' final play, a desperate attempt to regain control and destroy him in the process. But he also knew he couldn't back down. "Prepare for a fight," he said, his voice steely. "Because I'm not giving up." The news of the legal battle spread like wildfire. Headlines painted it as a clash of titans. Fallen CEO fights back against janitor turned owner. Social media buzzed with debates, some praising John for exposing corruption, while others questioned his methods. Inside Orion Corporation, the tension was palpable. Employees who had started to feel hopeful were now racked with uncertainty. John, however, was determined to stay calm. He spent hours with his legal team, poring over every detail of his transactions. "We've got nothing to hide," he reminded them. "Everything was legitimate. This is just a desperate move to discredit me." Despite his confidence, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Timmins had something up his sleeve. A week later, the first court hearing took place. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and a handful of Orion employees who had come to show their support for John. At the front of the room, Timmins sat with his high-powered legal team, a smug smile on his face. When John entered, wearing a tailored suit but carrying the same quiet confidence that had unnerved Timmins before, the room fell silent. He glanced at Timmins, who sneered in response. The battle lines were drawn. Timmins' lead attorney wasted no time launching an attack. "Your Honor, My client was unlawfully forced out of his position by Mr. Harris, who used insider information to manipulate the acquisition of Orion Corporation. This is not the story of a hero exposing corruption. It's a calculated scheme to overthrow a legitimate CEO. The judge raised an eyebrow. And what evidence do you have to support this claim? The attorney handed over a thick binder of documents. These transactions show suspicious timing, as well as connections between Mr. Harris and individuals who had access to confidential company information. John's attorney immediately countered. Your Honor, these claims are baseless. Every share Mr. Harris purchased was done through public markets or legally binding agreements. Furthermore, we have evidence of Mr. Timmons' extensive embezzlement and fraudulent activities. The judge looked over the documents, her expression neutral. We'll need to examine these claims thoroughly, she said. For now, I'm ordering a temporary freeze on any major corporate decisions at Orion Corporation until this case is resolved. It was a blow to John. Without the ability to make changes, he couldn't implement the reforms Orion desperately needed. Timmons, on the other hand, smirked as he left the courtroom, clearly reveling in the chaos he had caused. Back at the office, John called an emergency meeting with his most trusted advisors. Karen Wilson, who had proven herself loyal during the transition, spoke up. This freeze is exactly what Timmons wanted. He's trying to sabotage you by keeping you from fixing the company. John nodded. He thinks if the company continues to struggle, I'll take the blame. But we're not going to let that happen. They brainstormed ways to work around the restrictions. While they couldn't make major financial decisions, they could focus on morale and transparency. John began holding regular town halls, updating employees on the legal battle and assuring them that he wasn't giving up. We've come too far to let Timmons win, he told them during one meeting. This is our fight now, and we're going to win it together. The employees responded with cheers, their faith in John growing stronger by the day. But the fight was far from over. Late one night, John received an anonymous email with an attached video file. The subject line read, "You need to see this." Curious but cautious, he opened the file. His stomach dropped as the footage played. It showed a heated conversation between two men in a dimly lit room. One of them was Timmons. The other man's face was obscured, but his voice was clear. "You need to bury Harris," the man said. "If he wins, we're all exposed." Timmons nodded. "Don't worry. I've got people working on it. He won't make it to the end of this trial." John rewound the video, replaying the conversation to make sure he wasn't imagining things. The implications were chilling. Not only was Timmons plotting against him, but it seemed there were others involved, people with a lot to lose if John succeeded. He forwarded the email to his legal team and then sat in silence, his mind racing. Who had sent the video? Was it a trap, or was someone inside Timmons' circle trying to help? Either way, it was clear that the stakes were higher than he had realized. The next day, John called Karen into his office and showed her the video. Her eyes widened as she watched. "This changes everything," she said. "If we can verify this, it could destroy Timmons' case. But we need to be careful," John cautioned. "If this gets out before we're ready, it could backfire." They decided to keep the video under wraps while their legal team worked to authenticate it. In the meantime, John began digging deeper into Timmons' connections, trying to uncover the identities of the people behind the conspiracy. A week later, another bombshell dropped. One of John's most trusted advisors, a finance manager named Peter, was caught leaking confidential information to Timmons. Karen discovered the betrayal when she noticed discrepancies in the company's internal reports. Peter was confronted in a private meeting with John and Karen. At first, he denied everything, but when presented with the evidence, he broke down. "I didn't have a choice," he confessed. "They threatened my family." John's jaw tightened. "Who's they?" he demanded. Peter hesitated, fear etched across his face. "I don't know their names. Timmons just called them investors. They're powerful people, Mr. Harris. You don't want to cross them." John leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. "You've put this company and its employees in danger," he said. "But if you cooperate, I might be able to help you." Peter nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll tell you everything I know." The chapter ended on yet another high-stakes revelation. With enemies lurking in the shadows and the legal battle intensifying, John knew the road ahead would only get harder. But he also knew one thing for certain. He wasn't backing down. John sat in his office, his fingers tapping anxiously against the mahogany desk. The weight of Peter's confession was heavy. The mention of Timmins' mysterious investors sent a chill down his spine. These weren't just corporate rivals. They were shadowy figures willing to play dirty to protect their interests. Peter sat across from him, wringing his hands. "I swear, Mr. Harris, I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said. "But Timmins made it clear. If I didn't cooperate, they'd come after my family." John nodded, his expression unreadable. "You've put this company and its employees in danger," he said slowly. "But I believe in second chances. Tell me everything, and I'll make sure you're protected." Peter hesitated, then began spilling details. He revealed that Timmins had promised the investors significant payouts in exchange for their silence about the company's mismanagement. The investors, in turn, pressured employees like Peter to feed them confidential information, ensuring they stayed one step ahead of John. "What kind of information did you leak?" John asked. "Financial projections, staff changes, even some of your meeting notes," Peter admitted, his voice shaking. "They wanted to know how you plan to fight the injunction." John clenched his jaw. "And the investors? Did you meet them?" Peter shook his head. "No. Timmins was the only one in direct contact. But I overheard him talking about a private meeting in a few weeks. I don't know where, but it sounded important." John leaned back, deep in thought. A private meeting could be the break he needed. If he could uncover the identities of the investors, it might help dismantle Timmins' support network. But the risk was enormous. Meanwhile, Karen worked with the legal team to verify the video John had received. After days of analysis, their tech expert confirmed its authenticity. "This footage hasn't been doctored," he said. "Whoever sent it to you wanted you to have the truth." Karen looked at John. "We should submit this as evidence," she said. "It's our best shot at exposing Timmins' plans." John hesitated. "Not yet," he said. "If we play this card too early, Timmins will just deny it and shift the narrative. We need to wait for the right moment." As the legal battle dragged on, John continued to focus on the company's morale. He knew his employees were watching his every move, and he refused to let them see him falter. During a town hall meeting, he addressed the rumors swirling around the injunction. "I know these are uncertain times," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But let me make one thing clear. I'm not going anywhere. We've uncovered corruption at the highest levels, and that's why they're fighting so hard to stop us. But together, we will rebuild Orion into a company we can all be proud of." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in weeks, John felt a glimmer of hope. The employees believed in him, and he wasn't going to let them down. But as the days passed, the tension only grew. One night, as John was leaving the office, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted, and the engine idled quietly. At first, he thought it might be a coincidence, but when the vehicle started following him, his suspicions were confirmed. John's pulse quickened as he turned onto a side street, trying to lose the SUV. The car followed, maintaining a careful distance. He reached for his phone and called Karen. "I think I'm being followed," he said, his voice low. Karen's voice was sharp. "Get somewhere safe. Do you want me to call the police?" "No," John said. "Not yet. I'll handle it." He drove to a nearby parking garage, weaving through the levels until he found a hidden spot. He watched as the SUV circled once, then drove away. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate him. They were watching his every move. The following morning, John arrived at the office to find Karen waiting for him. "We need to talk," she said, pulling him into a conference room. She handed him a stack of papers. "These are from Peter. He managed to track down some of Timmins' private communications." "Look at this." John scanned the documents, his eyes widening. The emails revealed that Timmins had been planning the injunction for months, long before John had taken action against him. One email, in particular, stood out. "The board doesn't need to know the details. As long as we keep Harris distracted, the investors can handle the rest." John's stomach turned. "This proves Timmins was plotting against me before I even exposed him," he said. But who are these investors? Karen pointed to a name at the bottom of one email, Lewis Holdings. I did some digging, she said. It's a shell company. No real office, no public records. Whoever's behind it is covering their tracks. John's mind raced. He needed more information, fast. What about the private meeting Peter mentioned? He asked. Did he give you anything else? Karen nodded. He said it's happening next Thursday. He doesn't know where, but I might have a lead. The next week was a whirlwind of preparation. Karen tracked down a possible location for the meeting, a luxury hotel on the outskirts of the city. John decided to take a risk. Disguising himself as hotel staff, he planned to infiltrate the meeting and gather evidence. The night of the meeting, John stood in the hotel's service hallway, his heart pounding. He wore a waiter's uniform, complete with a tray of drinks. Through an earpiece, Karen guided him from a van parked outside. Okay, you're clear to go, she said. The meeting room is on the second floor, third door on the left. John nodded and made his way upstairs. As he approached the room, he heard muffled voices inside. He took a deep breath, then opened the door. The room fell silent as a dozen heads turned to look at him. Among them was Timmons, seated at the head of the table. His eyes narrowed as he recognized John. What the hell are you doing here? Timmons demanded, standing abruptly. John forced a smile, holding up the tray. Just delivering drinks, he said, his voice calm despite the tension. Timmons didn't buy it. Get him out of here, he barked to one of the security guards. Before John could react, the guard lunged toward him, grabbing his arm. But John wasn't leaving without a fight. He shoved the tray into the guard's chest and bolted for the door. Outside, Karen's voice crackled through the earpiece. John, what happened? Are you okay? I'm fine, he said, breathless. But I didn't get what I needed. As he ran to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was now in deeper trouble than ever. Timmons and his investors knew he was onto them, and they weren't going to back down. John slammed the car door and sped out of the hotel parking lot, his heart racing. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, scanning his rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. The shadows of the night felt thicker, more menacing, as though the darkness itself was conspiring against him. John, talk to me. Karen's voice crackled through the earpiece. Did they follow you? I don't think so, John said, his voice strained. But they know I was there. Timmons recognized me. Karen cursed under her breath. This complicates things. They'll be more cautious now. Cautious or not, John said, his jaw tight. I'm not backing down. Did you get anything from the hotel's network? Karen hesitated. Just fragments. Their meeting notes were encrypted, but I did manage to intercept one message before the system locked me out. It's an email from Timmons to someone called L. Donovan. What does it say? John asked. Karen read aloud. Ensure the funds are moved before Harris gets too close. Meet me tomorrow to finalize details. There's no location, but it's time-stamped for noon tomorrow. John's mind raced. That's our next move, he said. We have to intercept that meeting. John, this is dangerous, Karen warned. They already know you're onto them. If you push too hard, they might escalate. John exhaled sharply, his resolve hardening. They're already escalating. I can't let them win. The following morning, John and Karen worked tirelessly to track down the meeting location. Using the email's metadata, Karen pinpointed a potential site, a private airstrip just outside the city. It was the kind of place where deals happened away from prying eyes, shielded by wealth and secrecy. Are you sure about this? Karen asked as John prepared to leave. This could be a trap. John nodded. It probably is. But if I don't go, we'll never get the evidence we need. Karen handed him a small recording device. Just be careful, she said. And if things go south, call me immediately. The airstrip was quiet when John arrived, the hum of distant planes the only sound in the crisp morning air. He parked his car a safe distance away and approached on foot, his eyes scanning the area. A sleek black jet sat on the tarmac, its engines idling. Nearby, a small group of men stood in a tight circle, their voices low. John stayed hidden, using the cover of a maintenance shed to inch closer. He spotted Timmons among the men, his posture tense as he spoke to a tall, sharp-dressed figure. L. Donovan, John assumed. Their conversation was muffled, but John caught snippets of it as the wind carried their voices. Money's already been transferred, Timmons said. He doesn't have a case without it. Donovan nodded. Good. But we need to tie up loose ends. If Harris keeps pushing, we'll have to handle him. John's pulse quickened. He reached for the recording device in his pocket, angling it toward the men. Suddenly, one of the guards turned, his gaze sweeping the area. John ducked behind the shed, holding his breath. The guard's footsteps grew louder as he approached. Hey, the guard called out. Who's there? John's mind raced. If he ran, they'd know for sure he was spying. But staying meant he could be caught. He glanced around, spotting a pile of discarded tools nearby. Grabbing a wrench, he waited until the guard rounded the corner, then swung it against the metal wall, creating a loud clang. What the? The guard muttered, turning toward the noise. Taking advantage of the distraction, John slipped away, moving as quietly as he could toward the perimeter. Back in his car, John replayed the recording. The audio wasn't perfect, but the key phrases were clear enough. Timmons discussing the transfer of money and the intent to handle him. He called Karen. I got it, he said. It's not everything we need, but it's enough to prove Timmons and Donovan are plotting against me. Karen sighed in relief. That's a start. We'll need to cross-reference this with the other evidence we have. If we can link Donovan to Lewis Holdings, it'll be a major blow to their case. Later that day, John received an unexpected visitor at his office. It was Rachel, the young marketing associate who had spoken up during a town hall meeting weeks earlier. She looked nervous, clutching a folder tightly against her chest. Mr. Harris, she said, her voice low. I think you need to see this. John gestured for her to sit. His curiosity piqued. Rachel placed the folder on his desk and opened it, revealing pages of financial reports. I've been going through old marketing budgets, she explained. Something didn't feel right, so I started digging. Look at this. She pointed to a series of invoices, all marked as payments to a company called Vector Media. These were approved by Timmons, Rachel said. But Vector Media doesn't exist. I tried to find their office, their website, anything. There's nothing. John's brow furrowed. So the money wasn't going to a real company. It was being siphoned off. Rachel nodded. Exactly. And if you compare the amounts, they match some of the discrepancies Peter found in the financial reports. John leaned back, a mixture of anger and admiration swelling within him. Rachel, this is incredible work. You might have just uncovered another piece of the puzzle. She smiled nervously. I just want to help. We've all been through so much, and I believe in what you're trying to do. John felt a surge of gratitude. Despite the obstacles, there were people in Orion who genuinely wanted change. And with allies like Rachel and Karen, he knew he stood a fighting chance. That night, as John reviewed the day's findings, his phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was unknown, but the message was clear. Stay out of this, Harris, or you'll regret it. John stared at the screen, his mind racing. It was the first time the threats had been so direct, and it confirmed what he already knew. Timmons and his allies were getting desperate. But John wasn't afraid. If anything, the message only strengthened his resolve. He typed a quick reply and hit send. Bring it on. John woke up the next morning to the sound of his phone ringing. It was Karen, her voice laced with urgency. John, we have a problem, she said. One of our servers was hacked last night. They wiped several critical files. John sat up, his heart sinking. What kind of files? Karen sighed. Mostly financial records. But some of the evidence we were compiling on Timmons and Donovan is gone too. John clenched his jaw. Do we have backups? Some, Karen said, but not all of it. Whoever did this knew exactly what to target. John's mind raced. The text message he'd received the night before suddenly made more sense. This wasn't just intimidation, it was sabotage. We need to tighten security immediately, he said. And I want to know who's behind this. I'm already on it, Karen replied. I've contacted a cybersecurity expert to help trace the breach. I'll keep you updated. Later that morning, John gathered his team in the conference room. The mood was tense as Karen briefed them on the hack. This wasn't random, she said. The attacker specifically targeted files related to our case against Timmons and his investors. It's clear they're trying to derail us. Rachel raised her hand. Could it be someone inside the company? Someone still loyal to Timmons? Karen nodded. It's possible. We need to be vigilant. John leaned forward, his expression grim. This is a critical moment for us. They're trying to scare us, to make us feel powerless. But we're not going to let them win. We've rebuilt before, and we'll do it again if we have to. The team nodded, their determination renewed. Despite the setback, John could see the resolve in their eyes. They weren't giving up, and neither was he. Meanwhile, the cybersecurity expert, a sharp and unassuming man named Victor, worked tirelessly to trace the breach. After hours of combing through logs and encrypted data, he called Karen with an update. "I've found something," Victor said. The attack originated from an IP address linked to a private firm called Vanguard Solutions. They specialize in, let's just say, questionable cyber activities. Karen frowned. Do they have any ties to Timmons? Victor hesitated. I can't say for sure, but their client list is confidential. It's not a stretch to assume someone with Timmons' resources could hire them. Karen relayed the information to John, who immediately saw an opportunity. If we can link Vanguard Solutions to Timmons or Donovan, it'll be a major blow to their case, he said. Keep digging. As Victor worked behind the scenes, John focused on rebuilding trust within the company. He called another town hall meeting, addressing the hack and the challenges they were facing. I know many of you are worried, he said, but let me assure you, we're not going to let this stop us. This company has survived worse, and we will come out stronger. The employees applauded, their faith in John unwavering. Among them, Rachel watched with admiration. She approached him after the meeting. Mr. Harris, she said, I've been thinking, if they're targeting files, maybe we should start keeping hard copies of everything important. It's old school, but it might save us if this happens again. John smiled. That's a great idea, Rachel. Let's make it happen. Days later, Victor uncovered a breakthrough. He found a series of payments from Lewis Holdings, Donovan's shell company, to Vanguard Solutions. The amounts matched the timeline of the hack perfectly. Karen rushed into John's office with the news. We've got them, she said, handing him the report. This is the connection we've been looking for. John's eyes scanned the document, his excitement building. This is enough to subpoena Vanguard Solutions. If we can prove they were hired to sabotage us, it'll destroy Timmons' credibility. But just as John began to feel a glimmer of hope, another crisis struck. Late one night, as he was reviewing the evidence in his office, the fire alarm suddenly blared. He rushed to the hallway, where smoke filled the air. Everyone out, he shouted, ushering employees toward the exits. As they evacuated, John noticed the fire seemed localized to the records room. His heart sank. The hard copies Rachel had suggested were stored there. By the time the fire department arrived, the damage was done. The records room was destroyed, and with it, much of the evidence they had painstakingly gathered. Standing outside the building, watching the flames die down, John felt a mix of anger and despair. This was no accident. Someone had intentionally set the fire to cripple their case. Karen approached him, her face pale. This wasn't random, she said. They're escalating, John. I know, he replied, his voice steely. But they've underestimated us. We still have the recordings, the emails, and the support of this team. They can't destroy all of it. As the ashes cooled, John made a decision. He called an emergency meeting with Karen, Rachel, and the rest of his core team. We're done playing defense, he said. It's time to take the fight to them. Karen raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? We're going to expose everything, John said. The corruption, the sabotage, the investors, every last detail. And we're going to do it publicly. Rachel looked nervous. Won't that make us more of a target? Maybe, John admitted. But it'll also force them into the spotlight. They've been operating in the shadows for too long. It's time to drag them into the light. The next morning, John sat in front of a camera, recording a statement that would soon go viral. He detailed the corruption within Orion Corporation, the embezzlement, the sabotage, and the threats he had received. I've spent my life fighting for what's right, he said, and I won't stop now. To those trying to silence me, you may have money and power, but you don't have the truth. And the truth will win. As the video was uploaded and shared across social media, John braced himself for the storm that was about to come. The video went viral within hours, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. It was picked up by major news outlets, with headlines like CEO exposes corporate corruption in stunning video and Janitor turned owner declares war on corrupt investors. John's bold move ignited public support, with thousands of people rallying behind his cause. But as the attention grew, so did the stakes. The people John was fighting weren't the kind to back down quietly. The morning after the video aired, John arrived at the office to find a thick envelope waiting on his desk. There was no return address, and the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. He opened it cautiously, revealing a series of photographs. His heart sank. The photos were of his family, his mother shopping at a grocery store, his younger sister picking up her kids from school, and his brother jogging in the park. Each picture was accompanied by a note. "Stay out of this, or they'll pay the price." John gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. This wasn't just about him anymore. They were threatening his family, and that was a line he couldn't ignore. He called Karen immediately, his voice shaking as he explained what he'd found. "We need to protect them," Karen said firmly. "Move them somewhere safe until this is over." John nodded. "I'll handle it. But this changes nothing. If they think they can scare me into giving up, they're dead wrong." That night, John met with his family at a secluded location. He explained the situation, doing his best to reassure them. "I've already arranged for private security," he said. "You'll be safe. This is just their way of trying to intimidate me." His mother, a strong-willed woman who had always been his rock, placed a hand on his shoulder. "John, we trust you. Do what you have to do." Her words bolstered his resolve, but the weight of their safety hung heavily on him. He knew he couldn't afford any mistakes. Meanwhile, Karen and Victor worked tirelessly to uncover more connections between Timmons, Donovan, and the shadowy investors. The subpoena against Vanguard Solutions was filed, and the legal team began building a case against Lewis Holdings. But the opposition wasn't idle. Timmons held a press conference the next day, spinning his own narrative. "This is nothing more than a smear campaign," Timmons said, standing before a room of reporters. "John Harris is a fraud who's using baseless accusations to distract from his own illegal activities. He's the real danger to Orion Corporation." The press conference was a calculated move, and it worked. Some of the public began to doubt John's claims, and questions about his qualifications and motives started surfacing. The pressure on John intensified when Karen received a tip from one of her sources. "Timmons is planning a major event," the source said. "It's supposed to be a fundraiser, but it's really about rallying support against you." Karen relayed the information to John. "If he's hosting a fundraiser, you know the investors will be there," she said. "This could be our chance to expose them." John nodded. "We need a plan. If we can get solid evidence of their involvement, it'll turn the tide in our favor." The fundraiser was held at an extravagant mansion on the outskirts of the city. Undercover, John and Karen infiltrated the event, blending in with the crowd. John wore a sleek suit, while Karen disguised herself as catering staff, carrying a tray of champagne flutes. The room buzzed with laughter and conversation, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and cigars. At the center of it all was Timmons, shaking hands and laughing as though he didn't have a care in the world. Karen moved discreetly through the room, her hidden recording device capturing snippets of conversation. Meanwhile, John positioned himself near a group of men discussing what sounded like financial transfers. "I heard Donovan's team handled the last payment," one man said, swirling his drink. "Yeah, but Harris is making things difficult," another replied. "We might need to accelerate the contingency plan." John's pulse quickened. He casually leaned closer, pretending to check his phone while recording the exchange on his smartwatch. Just as John was starting to feel hopeful, the night took a sharp turn. One of the security guards at the event recognized him. The guard's eyes narrowed, and he whispered into his radio. Moments later, 2 more guards appeared, making their way toward John. Karen's voice crackled in his earpiece. "John, they've spotted you. You need to get out now." John glanced around, calculating his options. The guards were closing in fast. He spotted a side door leading to the garden and made a break for it. The guards shouted after him, but John didn't stop. He sprinted through the garden, weaving between hedges and statues. Behind him, he could hear their footsteps growing louder. He turned a corner and nearly collided with Karen, who had slipped out through another exit. "This way," she whispered, grabbing his arm and leading him toward a side gate. They made it to the car just as the guards reached the edge of the property. Tires screeched as Karen sped away, leaving the guards shouting in frustration behind them. Back at the office, John reviewed the recordings from the event. While the audio wasn't perfect, it confirmed the investors' involvement in the sabotage. But it wasn't enough to end the fight. They needed more, something undeniable. Karen looked at him, her expression serious. "We're close, John, but they're getting more aggressive. We need to stay one step ahead." John nodded. "I know, and I'm ready for whatever comes next." The chapter closed with John staring at his reflection in the office window, the city lights twinkling behind him. He knew the battle was far from over, but he was more determined than ever to see it through. The storm was coming, and he was ready to face it head-on. The next morning, John awoke to a barrage of notifications. His phone buzzed relentlessly, and Karen's name lit up on the screen. "Karen, what's going on?" he asked, groggy but alert. "John, you need to check the news," Karen said, her voice tense. "Timmons just pulled his biggest move yet." John turned on the TV and felt his stomach drop. Timmons was being interviewed on a national morning show, spinning a web of lies. "This has been a coordinated attack on my reputation and the integrity of Orion Corporation," Timmons said, his tone measured and rehearsed. "John Harris is manipulating the public for his own gain. He was never qualified to run a company of this scale, and now he's dragging it down with him." The interviewer nodded sympathetically. "Do you have any proof of these claims?" Timmons smirked. "We've uncovered financial discrepancies that suggest Harris has been using company funds for personal expenses. And as for his accusations about me and my investors, they're baseless. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to cover his own failures." John's fists clenched. He knew Timmons was lying, but the damage was already done. Social media was flooded with comments, some supporting John but many questioning his credibility. Karen called again. "We need to respond, John. If we let this narrative take root, it could undo everything we've worked for." John exhaled slowly. "We'll respond, but not yet. Let Timmons think he's winning. When we strike, it'll be with proof so solid, no one can deny it." That afternoon, Karen and Victor worked tirelessly to analyze the recordings and documents from the fundraiser. Meanwhile, Rachel dug deeper into the financial records, uncovering more evidence of Timmons' embezzlement. Hours later, Victor called John and Karen into his office. "I've found something big," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "The Lewis Holdings account is directly linked to Timmons' personal offshore accounts. Every dollar funneled through Vanguard Solutions traces back to him." Karen's jaw dropped. "This is it. This is the smoking gun we've been looking for." Victor nodded. "But there's more. I found emails between Timmons and Donovan discussing plans to fabricate evidence against you. They've been setting you up since the moment you took over." John leaned forward, his expression grim. "How fast can we get this into the court record?" Victor hesitated. "It'll take a few days to prepare everything. But once it's submitted, their case will fall apart." John nodded. "Then let's move quickly. We've waited long enough." The next day, John received an unexpected visit from an unlikely ally. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit walked into his office, introducing himself as Richard Langston, a former board member of Orion. "Mr. Harris," Langston said, his tone respectful, "I think we might have a common goal." John raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Langston sighed. "I resigned from the board 2 years ago because I couldn't stand Timmons' greed and mismanagement. I've been following your fight, and I believe you're the only one who can save this company." John studied the man carefully. "Why come forward now?" "Because I have information that can help you," Langston said. "Timmons has a second set of books. They detail every illegal transaction he's made over the last 5 years. I can help you get them." John's skepticism softened into curiosity. "Why would you help me?" "Because I care about Orion," Langston said simply. And because Timmons has hurt too many people. It's time he faced justice. John nodded slowly. All right. What do you need from me? Langston leaned in. Access to the server room in the main office. That's where Timmons stored the backups. With the right credentials, we can recover the files. That night, Langston, John, and Karen devised a plan. Langston would guide Karen through the server room while John acted as a lookout. It was risky, but they had no other choice. The second set of books could be the final piece of evidence they needed to bring Timmons down. At midnight, they entered the building, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Karen carried a small laptop and a toolkit, her face set with determination. Langston led the way, his familiarity with the building evident. When they reached the server room, Langston input a series of codes, and the heavy door slid open. You've got about 20 minutes before the system logs this access, he said. Make it count. Karen nodded and got to work, her fingers flying across the keyboard. John stayed by the door, his ears tuned for any sound of approaching guards. Minutes ticked by, and tension hung thick in the air. Finally, Karen let out a triumphant gasp. I've got it, she whispered, holding up a USB drive. Everything we need is on here. Just as they turned to leave, an alarm blared, flooding the hallway with red light. They know we're here. Langston shouted. Move. John barked, leading the way. The three of them sprinted down the hall as security guards flooded the building. They barely made it out, ducking into an alley as the guards searched the surrounding area. Karen clutched the USB drive tightly, her face pale but triumphant. We did it, she said, her voice trembling with adrenaline. We have everything. John looked at her and Langston, a rare smile breaking through his serious demeanor. This is the beginning of the end for Timmons. The chapter ended with John staring at the USB drive, knowing it held the key to justice. But the battle wasn't over yet. Timmons wouldn't go down without a fight, and John was ready for whatever came next. John sat in his office, the USB drive clutched tightly in his hand. The weight of its contents felt heavy, not just in a physical sense, but in the knowledge of what it represented. The second set of books detailed everything: embezzlement, fraudulent transactions, bribes, and even the names of Timmons' shadowy investors. Karen and Victor worked tirelessly to organize the data, preparing it for submission to the court. This is it, John, Karen said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. This evidence isn't just enough to dismantle their case. It's enough to destroy them completely. John nodded, but his face remained serious. We can't make a single mistake. Timmons is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. The following morning, John's legal team filed the evidence with the court. The document dump was massive, and the implications were explosive. News of the filing spread quickly, with reporters swarming Orion's headquarters for comments. John maintained his silence, knowing that the courtroom would be the only place to reveal the full story. But Timmons didn't stay quiet. Hours after the filing, he held another press conference, his tone more aggressive than ever. These so-called evidence dumps are nothing more than fabrications, Timmons said, his voice booming through the microphones. Harris is using lies and deceit to cover up his own incompetence. I will fight this with everything I have. His words stirred skepticism among his loyalists, but the cracks in his armor were beginning to show. Even some of his staunchest supporters began to distance themselves, unwilling to sink with a sinking ship. As the court date approached, tensions at Orion reached a boiling point. Employees whispered nervously in hallways, unsure of what the future held. John addressed them in another town hall meeting, his voice calm but resolute. I know this has been a difficult time for all of us, he said, but I want you to know that we're fighting for more than just this company. We're fighting for integrity, for accountability, and for the future of everyone who works here. The employees applauded, their faith in John unwavering. But as John left the stage, Karen pulled him aside. Her face was pale, her voice low. John, we have a problem, she said. Langston's gone missing. Langston's disappearance sent shockwaves through the team. He had been scheduled to meet with John and Karen that morning to prepare for his testimony, but he never showed up. Calls to his phone went straight to voicemail, and his house was empty. This isn't a coincidence, John said, pacing his office. Timmons must have something to do with this. Karen nodded. We need to find him, John. Without his testimony, the case will be harder to win. Victor joined the conversation, his expression grim. I've been monitoring Timmons' communications. There's nothing directly tying him to Langston's disappearance, but I did find something else. A flight manifest. John frowned. A flight manifest? Victor nodded. Timmons' private jet is scheduled to leave the country tomorrow night. Destination: the Cayman Islands. Karen's eyes widened. He's trying to run. John shook his head, his jaw tightening. Not on my watch. The next day, John's team worked tirelessly to piece together Langston's whereabouts. Using traffic camera footage and cell phone data, Victor tracked Langston to a remote warehouse on the outskirts of the city. This could be dangerous, Karen said as they prepared to leave. We should call the police. John shook his head. If Timmons has anything to do with this, he'll have already paid someone to stall the authorities. We need to handle this ourselves. That night, John, Karen, and Victor arrived at the warehouse, their hearts pounding. The area was dimly lit, with shadows stretching across the cold concrete. They parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, their movements silent and deliberate. Inside the warehouse, Langston was tied to a chair, his face bruised but defiant. Timmons stood in front of him, flanked by two burly men who looked more like mercenaries than security guards. You should have stayed out of this, Timmons growled, his voice dripping with menace. But no, you had to play the hero. Langston smirked, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. You're going to lose, Timmons. Harris is 10 steps ahead of you. Timmons laughed, a cold, hollow sound. We'll see about that. From their hiding spot, John and Karen watched the scene unfold, their breaths shallow. We need to get him out of there, Karen whispered. John nodded. I have an idea. Using the element of surprise, John and Karen entered the warehouse through a side door, creeping closer to where Langston was being held. Karen held up her phone, recording everything as John prepared to intervene. Just as Timmons raised his hand to strike Langston, John stepped forward, his voice booming. That's enough, Timmons. Timmons froze, his head snapping toward John. You, he spat. How did you find me? That doesn't matter, John said, his voice calm but firm. What matters is that this ends now. Timmons' guards moved toward John, but Karen stepped out of the shadows, holding up her phone. Think carefully, she said. Everything you've done here is on camera. The police will love this. The guards hesitated, glancing at each other. Timmons glared at them. What are you waiting for? Get them. Before they could act, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. John had tipped off the police after all, and their timing was perfect. Timmons' face twisted with rage as the guards backed away, unwilling to risk arrest. Moments later, the warehouse was flooded with flashing lights, and officers stormed in, taking Timmons and his men into custody. Langston was rushed to the hospital, where he was treated for minor injuries. Despite his ordeal, he insisted on testifying against Timmons. With the second set of books and Langston's testimony, John's case was stronger than ever. As the police led Timmons away in handcuffs, he turned to John, his eyes filled with venom. This isn't over, Harris, he hissed. You haven't won yet. John watched him go, his expression unyielding. It's over, Timmons. You just don't know it yet. The chapter ended with John standing outside the warehouse, the weight of the battle still pressing on his shoulders. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt the tide turning in his favor. The courtroom was packed. The final hearing of John Harris versus Robert Timmons had drawn national attention. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse, reporters jostled for sound bites, and supporters of both sides gathered in droves. Inside, the tension was thick as John sat at the plaintiff's table with his legal team, including Karen and Victor. Across the room, Timmons sat with his high-powered attorneys, his expression a mask of forced confidence. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. This was it, the culmination of months of investigation, sabotage, and resilience. The prosecution began by laying out their evidence. Karen presented the second set of books, meticulously tying every fraudulent transaction back to Timmons and his network of investors. Victor's testimony detailed the cyber sabotage orchestrated through Vanguard Solutions. They played the recording from the fundraiser, where Donovan and Timmons discussed the contingency plan, and Karen revealed the footage from the warehouse, showing Timmons' threats to Langston. Finally, Langston took the stand. His voice was steady as he described Timmons' years of embezzlement and the lengths he went to cover it up. He thought he was untouchable, Langston said, glaring at Timmons. But greed has a way of exposing the truth. When it was John's turn, he stood confidently, addressing the court and the jury. This case isn't just about me, he said. It's about every employee who was ignored, every dollar stolen, and every dream crushed by Robert Timmons and his corrupt practices. Today, we're fighting for accountability and justice, not just for Orion Corporation, but for anyone who's ever been silenced by people like him. The courtroom was silent as John returned to his seat, his words resonating with everyone present. Timmons' defense team fought back hard, attempting to discredit John at every turn. They argued that John's methods were unconventional and that the evidence had been obtained under questionable circumstances. But their arguments faltered in the face of the overwhelming proof. The recordings, the financial documents, and Langston's testimony painted a damning picture. The final blow came when the court subpoenaed Vanguard Solutions records. The company, desperate to protect itself, cooperated fully, handing over emails and financial records that directly implicated Timmons and his investors. It was the final nail in the coffin. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty. The courtroom erupted as the judge read the decision. Timmons was convicted of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy, and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. His investors, including Donovan, faced similar charges. John sat back in his chair, the weight of months of struggle finally lifting. Karen leaned over, her smile radiant. "We did it, John." "No," John said, smiling back. "We all did it." The aftermath of the trial was transformative for Orion Corporation. With Timmons and his cronies gone, John worked tirelessly to rebuild the company. He promoted Karen to Chief Operating Officer, recognizing her unwavering dedication. Rachel became the head of marketing, her initiative and sharp eye for details invaluable to the company's new direction. John implemented policies that prioritized transparency and employee well-being. Regular town halls became a cornerstone of Orion's culture, fostering open communication and trust. The company's financial performance rebounded as investors and clients regained confidence in its leadership. Months later, John stood on the stage at a company-wide event, addressing a crowd of employees. "This isn't just a victory for Orion," he said. "It's a victory for integrity, for justice, and for the belief that doing the right thing is worth fighting for. Together, we've built something stronger than it ever was before. And together, we'll keep moving forward." The crowd erupted into applause, their faith in John and the company's future unwavering. As John left the stage, Karen walked up beside him. "How does it feel?" she asked. John smiled, the first genuine, unburdened smile he'd worn in months. "It feels like freedom," he said, "and it feels like we're just getting started." In the weeks that followed, the story of the janitor-turned-owner became a symbol of resilience and justice. John's journey inspired countless others, proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, integrity and perseverance could triumph. And as for Timmons, his reign of greed and corruption had ended. The world had moved on without him, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions alone. John Harris had fought and won not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in a better way. His story became a legend, a testament to the power of courage and determination. And though the battle was over, John knew his journey was far from finished. He had rebuilt Orion. Now, he was ready to lead it into a brighter future.